Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, to Coffee Time with Connor and Colt. No, actually, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Christus Rex blogcast. I'm your host, CG Billiot, and today we are blessed and honored to have Connor Neville from Ekklesia Design with us. Connor, please do the folks a favor, introduce yourself to them, and tell us a little bit about what it is you do.
Well, good morning, Cole. Thank you so much for the opportunity and coffee time because it is very early morning when we're recording this. um, it is a blessing to be able to talk with you this morning. I think one of the first ways that I'd like to introduce Ekklesia Design is just the tagline. It's local churches redeeming places, and I'm sure we'll probably come across what that means and unpacking it in our conversation, but it really is the intention to encourage the local Christian body that gathers as the church. So individual Christians, collections of Christians, the assembled body, to redeem the place where they are. And it's a landscape architecture development planning firm. It's a design, ideally in the grand vision, it's a vertically integrated business that has a lot of other services and products that are accompanying all of the efforts of what it means to take dominion. So it really is a practical dominion-taking endeavor that is intended to equip and to exhort the church unto that good work. And there's a lot of overlap. I've known you for a little over a year or two now, just on social media we connected, but grateful to finally have a face-to-face, so to speak, interview with you.
Right. It has been a while, and folks might remember we did a project a couple months ago talking about the biblical nature of architecture and exactly what you were just talking about, the church, the local church, redeeming local places. I love that. As we'll be talking about today, apparently such a concept is impossible, perhaps to many, but as they go on doing it. But yeah, man, I'm really excited, and I will give a shout out. This is going to sound really goofy, and that's because it is, but the red hair, the red beard is a big appreciation factor for me because my family is like one of the dying races of redheads. And so like I had to marry a redhead. My wife's a redhead, and we're really hoping that our son will be a redhead, but we'll keep praying and see. And so good to see them represented here today for sure.
Nice. I love that. I'm so grateful. I got my mini. I have a son who's a redhead, looks just like me. And my wife has dark hair and dark eyes and tan complexion, and so it's powerful enough to push through those dominant traits. She got her mini. Our daughter looks just like her. And then we just had a third child 4 weeks ago. Today,
no
actually.
way.
And he has the first one with dark hair. So, anyways.
That's awesome, man. Yeah, congratulations. I didn't know that. And that sounds a lot like my family. My mom, the daughter of Irish immigrants, basically, and my dad, a Native American. So same thing, dark hair, dark skin, dark eyes. But then you get my brother, who's gets sunburn, open in the fridge, and he's got red hair. So you know how it is. You know how it is. But I wanted to mention before we got into today's content too. So Ekklesia Design, like you mentioned, one, love the mission, love what you've been doing. Anyone who follows your page can be blessed by it. You don't have to be some kind of architectural or engineering guru because it's very practical, which again, we'll get into. But I wanted you to mention too, Dominion Maps, I know is a project of yours as well. Can you tell the folks a little bit about that? Because I think it's wonderful and fascinating.
Absolutely. The tagline of Dominion Maps is cartography for Christ's kingdom. And cartography is the art of map making. Carta means charting, like it's the mapping. And it's an art form. So it's basically wall hangings, any kind of decor that you want to be able to represent a map in your pastor's office, in your home as decor, as like favorite places, things that mean a lot to you as your homestead, the outer boundary of it, just to be able to look at it and ponder it all the time. It's a product-based business where it's creating different maps for people to hang, but then it's also a service-based business because there's mapping analytics, geospatial analysis, and that's a background skill set of mine where it really does leverage GIS and mapping technology to help people understand the resources that are around them, to have them mapped, because ultimately you can't take dominion over something that you don't know about. And with your military background, I know you're very familiar, being able to have land navigation, have any kind of sense of where you are to then take the hill, to know how to strategically maneuver and navigate across a landscape You need to know the lay of the land, so to speak, and Dominion Maps helps people do that, and it kind of serves as it's intended to serve as literally a base map for any of the design work and the development future contemplation of how to concept plan or master plan a property. Dominion Maps functions as the base map generator engine for that.
I don't know how anyone could listen to that and not think that's so awesome. Like I'm a big nerd for that kind of stuff, and I also just wanted to poke you a little bit, like, but Connor, isn't Google Maps enough? But we could do. I would love to have a whole other episode where we just talk about the theology of cartography, of how the lay of the land ties with theology of the land and a people tied to that land. Like, yeah, there's a lot of conversation there. But today we'll be sorting through more of the, I don't want to say aftershock, but more of the implications of some trouble that I got myself in with CrossPolitic guys. So the dilemma was such that CrossPolitic was invited to speak at a conference down in South Louisiana, where literally my brother lives. He lives in the town that they did the conference. And basically during a live Q&A panel, they were asked a scenario question of, hey, you've got this very, very, very well below the poverty line family that comes in, all right, and what does the church do to help them and get them out of that circumstance? So Toby did most of the responding, and what I later demonstrated was his response was thoroughly biblical. It was sound. I didn't take issue with anything that he said. I was just a little bit concerned of what he didn't say, or perhaps what he could have added. And so then I just sent in a bunch of questions to the CrossPolitic guys, and then they responded with an entire episode. I didn't even expect to to get any response, but I definitely didn't expect that. And I had people at my church like, "What are you doing? What are you doing? Like, we just got planted. What are you doing? You're going to bring controversy." I was like, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. But I figured here's what we would do, because Connor, you were one of the first people to reach out and give me your opinion, which I think was right. It was more clear than what I said, one, and two, it really highlighted some other issues that I think people need to be thinking about, and I wanted them to be able to hear from your mouth in this episode. So I'll read these questions again, and my first question to you is going to be, what did you think of these questions? Were they reasonable? So here were the questions. Quote, if we're talking about actual tactics, since that was the name of the conference, practical ways of helping such a family, while I agree with everything that was said about the individual work ethic required in a family unit, confessing their sins, working hard, paying their debts, is it not so that with the various spheres of government, that while I would agree the state should have no hand in welfare, there may be some overlap with the church government? Given that, as we see in the book of Acts, and as we see for the last 2,000 years, the church has always offered mercy ministries to such families. But if we're going to be even more strategic over the next several generations, shouldn't churches have an active role encouraging families to participate in the Christian economy, which would also look like various parishioners working together to aid such a family, bringing them into the fold of a church economy? Those are the kind of practical things I would like to hear each of you discuss. I'm not just talking about financial handouts, although there needs to be some principle of giving without expecting anything in return. What I am talking about is literally teaching your congregation, hey, here's how you homestead. Here's how you become self-sufficient. How we become self-sufficient as a community. What about a church garden, where we literally give to the orphan and widow and downtrodden? What are some actual, practical, hands-on ways to provide and bring people up, where there isn't a dichotomy between giving a man a fish and teaching him how to fish? How about we do both? Some things like that I would love to hear from you guys to put practical application to the biblical principles you gave. A mouthful for sure, brevity, not my gift. Connor, what do you make of all of it?
I mean, I second it with a hearty amen. The response you gave made me chuckle, and even there just now you said it. Like the conference name was Tactics, right? And so sue you for asking for tactics, not principles.
Right.
And first off, I want to clarify, as you did, because of the brotherly fellowship with the CrossPolitic guys and the whole operation with Moscow, huge fan, subscriber to Canon Plus. I'm on the the FLF network, like
Yep.
as a member, like been to conferences, been to the FLF conferences, love their stuff, and there's no ill will. And I think it is an odd moment of cognitive dissonance where in your response you call them out for like, this is what you guys are doing by forming these networks of businesses and stuff. So for them to give a principled answer that doesn't touch down in any kind of real way, other than the real ways that Toby said of like confessing your sin and like taking personal responsibility over providing for your own family, like that, amen. I agree with all what they said. And then as your follow-up would have it further push the agenda into the corners, it seems like the opportunity for church extension or mercy ministries, like you used that term, that's where the question lies. And it was a little strange for them to, again, have the cognitive dissonance that that's not what they're doing, but it is what they're doing, right?
Right.
They gave an answer of, whoa, overlap of spheres of sovereignty of the family responsibility and church sovereignty as an instituted government under God, and then civil magistrate having that kind of sphere, no overlap. That might have been the red flag term that I think they caught on to. So that said, do gears overlap, right? And you
Right.
can't just rev the engine in neutral. You're going to go nowhere, right? You have to
Right.
engage the whole car, is what their expression of all of Christ for all of life means. They're preaching in the church all of Christ for every area of life, but it engages, like it actually connects, and then the gears move, you know? So
Right.
I think in one sense, what you're trying to do is connect the dots, connect the gears, and how do you move the vehicle along? What are the tactics, the actual touch points that that type of theology, the principled theology, is actually able to be manifested and realized in our lives? Because our theology flows out of our fingertips. That's something just in general, I echo all of your sentiments, and then I'm sure as we'll get into, there's practical ways to do so.
Right. Right. Yeah, and I appreciate that, man, because like when they initially responded and the different directions they went, I was like, okay, am I crazy? Like, was this too difficult of a question? Was it not reasonable? Um, but I think you, even just in that summary, you identified some of the things that I was trying to make apparent, namely that I was, if nothing else, I was just asking them to explain how they have done what they have done.
Yeah.
Them, the entire Moscow crew, because same thing, guilty as charged. I'm a pub member. I pay for Canon Plus. Like we're all devouring this content. So we just want some practical steps of how do we get there. And I think that as we'll get into as well, I think there is a healthy hesitation because we're fearful of handouts turning into just forced distribution. That's fine. You can have that healthy skepticism. We're worried about people immediately leaning into the practical and divorcing the principle, and thus we become kind of works based individuals as opposed to doctrinally based individuals. Those are all fine hesitations, but one of the things that I wanted to identify too is like, okay, that's fine, but at what point do we actually get to work? At what point do we actually help that family? But I think one of the things that you reached out to me and you were like same kind of disposition that I held of like, what the heck just happened? Why did we went from, hey, how do we help this starving family, to Leo the Great, usurping the role of the state via the Pope, right? Being the Pope. So I was like, what just happened? But you brought up a point that was so on the nose that even later in the weekend, my pastor asked me the same question, and I was like, "You wouldn't believe it." This random guy on Instagram asked me the same question. He was like, or at least pointed out the same observation, and the observation you had was that clearly there are different perspectives on like, are we talking about the church institutional, or are we talking about that? I believe the phrase you used was actual church body practical. And when my pastor asked me the same question, I was like, one, Connor's a genius because he identified that dichotomy before you did. And then two, I think in my response to him, I was like, I think it's a little bit of both. Because again, and I'm not going off of anything that the CrossPolitic guys aren't doing. Because one of the things that I identified in my response is like they were freaking out when I was talking about financially helping a family that's starving. But if I had said, hey, we should give them scholarships so that their kids could be in Christian education, they would have been like, oh, yeah, that's great. We'll do that. So it's like, where's the disconnect here? So there you have the church institutional. But in terms of the church body practical, I know that you really have been a big voice for that kind of networking and connectivity. Do you want to speak to that that observation that you made between the church institutional, the church practical, and then what do we do? Is it both? Is it a little bit? Because you talked about overlap, so I wanted to lean into that a little bit more.
Yeah, I love that. And starting off introducing Ekklesia Design, I was saying local churches, but it's the local gathered body. That's what Ekklesia, the Ecclesia of God, is the gathered assembly of those who have been called, right? So it is the saints in a local place. That's what all the pastoral epistles are addressing to the church in Ephesus. It's not to the building in Ephesus. It's to the people who are the saints of God there. And so the ecclesiology, the systematic category of theology that people often have this weird, I don't know how it's being informed. I guess I could pinpoint a couple eras in history where the general state of evangelicalism's ecclesiology is such that as soon as you hear church, you think of the institutional administration of word and sacrament, and that's the sphere sovereignty of that instituted government of the church. But Ekklesia Design, I've said on a couple of podcasts and on my platform that design comes from the Latin designare, which means to make decisions. So it is the church making decisions. It's the gathered assembly of those who have been called making decisions. That's what Ekklesia Design is trying to encourage. And it means making decisions on taking dominion locally, making decisions on community reform in a good way, in a Christian, like building out Christ's kingdom kind of way. I think that's been done in history. We're not pioneering some new social gospel dimension to this.
Right.
Faithful men who have been heralded by all of us in a lot of different ways, a lot of the CrossPolitic guys, we would all look to people, even though he was Catholic, Chesterton, and a lot of other people, Hilaire Belloc, and people who advocated the distributism model. That's something that can be redeemed by Protestants in a lot of the ways that we're talking about. But the church body practical is something that is more of a proper read of how the scriptures and especially the New Testament talks about the church. Because in Ephesians 3:10, it is the church that is the purposed means of God to reveal to all the principalities and powers, to all the authorities, the manifold wisdom of God. That's how he's going to do it. It's through the church. So that's the vehicle, that's the spearhead. That's where the power of the Holy Spirit is working primarily. And it's not, again, call into question your definition of what you hear when you hear us say church. It's the church body practical that's actually going to do that. It's not just merely an assembled group hearing the word and sacrament and it stops there. It's the ones that then, Sunday afternoon through Saturday evening have stuff to do. Assuming that there's a Sabbath there too, where you
But, no, I mean that's huge. That's huge. I was going to say, and I don't think they would have. I don't think intellectually the CrossPolitic guys could say otherwise from what you just said. Because as I pointed out in my response, like these are guys who, in light of the teaching from their church, have gone on to do. They've created their own businesses, their own podcasts, and they host conferences for other Christian business leaders. So they are doing exactly what you've articulated. But I think what I wanted to lean into more is, while I certainly agree with you, what you're saying is I would say the overwhelming majority of the kind of activity that we're describing will be through the church body actual or church body practical. I still think that there is inevitably some space for the church institutional because, as what I try to point out in my response, is that spheres overlap. We all see Venn diagrams. And so what I would love for them to further articulate is, what's those little slits between each of the three spheres, what's going to fall into those that the state and church share, that the church and family share, that the family and state share. I didn't have that. Yeah, I didn't have that answer, but I wanted them to get towards that. And I think when you talk about something like distributionism or distributivism, that certainly has something to say too. But I didn't know if you wanted to lean into that more of speaking to those overlaps where you have the institutional church, the state, the family, how like we might ignore them intellectually and say, no, there is no overlap. But practically, like we fall into those overlaps daily, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And I mean, they did take the question of mercy ministry to Pope Leo. They did take that jump as a logical conclusion, and it seemed like a big jump. But at the same time, I completely tracked with what Toby was saying, and I get it, because the organized church, the ecclesiology proper, as you think about how big you can build that tower, so to speak, it becomes an idol eventually, because the more bloated and big it gets, and the more programs and the more things that, as you've mentioned, the more things that become distractions, there's actually less of there's a mission drift. There's less of a central focus on what they're supposed to be doing with the administration of word and sacrament. And I think ideally that has overflow into the surrounding communities. And most churches, faithful ones that have finances in order, probably have a deacons fund. And deacons funds help, the orphan and widow. They help the temporarily misfortuned, like the people who are in tough times. So ideally, there is a diaconate ministry, but that doesn't stop with, it doesn't stop with just applied teaching and theology. It has monies in an account that actually go buy things and build things and do things. And
Right.
the bigger the church historically had other concerns, like the cloisters of the different monasteries, and you don't build cathedrals without a building commission and without people who are contracting with the local artisans and the craftsmen and the people. You don't have these orphanages or hospitals or Christian schools or schools for the less fortunate. And I mean, all of what Chalmers did in Scotland is something that he was a social reformer, but he did that as a minister, and he did that with the funds that were granted to the church that he was essentially. Pastors aren't CEOs, but it is an office. So you are the chief executive officer over the resources that you are called to marshal in a military application. If you're a general, like, you have a sense of which every piece needs to fit together, and how there's different battalions, there's different strategic missions, there's different special operations that all flow together to the same mission that you're a general over, right? So I think that's kind of the goal of seeing the church militant. Maybe is a different way of wording this instead of church body practical. But how can the church militant advance these kinds of missions? So I don't know, maybe I just leave it there, because that flips it over.
No, I mean, I mean, I think, of course, military guy, right? No, I think you're about 80% of the question that I was going to ask, because, if it's the church militant ... then what are the marching orders? Was really the heart of my question. But I mean, gracious, we can get into a can of worms about, again, what are the roles of the institutional church through the church body actual, which is what we're certainly highlighting here. And again, these are these men who we love, right? They've read up on their Reconstructionists, so they know that Rushdoony, for example, one of his biggest theories or ideals that he really wanted to see come to fruition in the American church was the reestablishment of the tithe as God's building block for his institutional church. He was, I mean, being a pioneer in this country for homeschooling, he was like, you can equip your people to do so through the tithe, because that is going into God's storehouse and then going back to bless God's people. Like, he saw the tithe as, in the same way that the federal government takes more than the tithe, to create infrastructure and to multiply resources for its citizens. Like, the church should be doing that with the tithe. And so, like, I know they've read that. And again, their churches do things like that. So those were kind of things I wanted to bring to the forefront. But given that said, before we get to how you would have responded to my questions, because and certainly we've hinted at that at this point, could you explain a little bit more too about, I know that you've been on other podcasts discussing this. I highly recommend people go check out the podcast that you did with Christ in Capital. about distributionism or distributivism. We've thrown that term around a little bit. Can you talk a little bit about what that is? You talked about the Christians who believed in it, and how that could actually play a role into what we're describing.
Yes, it's an interesting, again, a majority of their proponents of that socioeconomic political theory were Catholic. So it's an interesting coupling with the institutional Catholic Church in its apparatus, in the larger apparatus that it was operating under. So you have to kind of assume that much of ecclesiastical strength and ability, right, within the community outreach, within everything that the Catholic Church had at the. So it was mostly in the 19th century. I think it was being articulated by a lot of the figureheads. First of all, I'd point people to Dr. George Grant's page on the Canon app to listen to his message on it. That's probably the best summary that you could get.
Yep.
So good. I would do no justice trying to summarize that. So, so
plus he's
general,
got good jokes. He's always got good jokes, so you're going to be entertained.
That's right. But it really is. It's mostly it makes people from both sides of the political aisle in our currently divided system. It makes people uncomfortable and nervous and squiggle in their seats because it sounds really socialist to a lot of conservatives, and it sounds really Christian and conservative to a lot of the liberals. So it's really just a matter of kind of like the Ekklesia Design background of those words. It's really the church making decisions on how to distribute the wealth and resources of the kingdom accordingly. And it's because the pastors, the shepherd of the sheep, the people who know the condition of their flock and know the frame of their congregants probably have a better understanding of how to reallocate. There's the red flag word, reallocate funds, or redistribute them, so to speak. And I think that's really the apparatus by which wealth redistribution could ever possibly be done honorably and ethically, is if it's done with the firm guardrails of biblical principles and what's ethical in God's economy. It's just redistributing the resources within the body of the church, but then there's outflow opportunities for funds to then bless non-believers in the surrounding community. So I think distributism is probably best summarized as it's wealth redistribution.
Exactly what it sounds like.
Yeah. And I don't think it was ever perfectly realized. So I think that was also kind of like socialists say that there's not like a successful example of capitalism that's ever really been tried. I think it's kind of like that too, where it's a unactualized theory still.
Right. I think the skeleton of it, if you will, existed in Kuyper's Netherlands, right, where you had a decentralized governance that, again, the skeleton exists, but the flesh of empowering people to then, fully realize that skeleton didn't come to fruition, or at least in the long run, for us to have a body of data. Because I think really the beauty of distributionism is that it would supply flesh to that decentralized skeleton or decentralized structure. So aside from the guys you mentioned, Chesterton, Belloc, I would actually point to, again, guys like Rushdoony, or even further back, Dabney, which I know that the CrossPolitic guys have read. And you got to see it like this, is whereas as sociopolitical theories, communism says we must seize the means of production, and that's generally overseen by the commune, although every time in reality it's always worked out to be the state. And so then they get to pick winners and losers, which is quote unquote what they hate. Capitalism, strict crony capitalism, says like, hey, the means of production are for anyone to go out and grab. And again, what ends up happening is whoever basically has the most power and leverage will seize those, and then again pick winners and losers. What distributionism says is we are actually going to distribute the means of production, so that Chesterton had said, what is it, a cow and 3 chickens for every man, so that you still have the capacity for individual excellence, as some can do more with that than others. But in all things, all people are provided for. And so what that would look like at a covenantal structure is that, and where this gets incredibly practical, because this all sounds very academic, but the guys, they kind of chided at when I mentioned things like homesteading or teaching people to be self-sufficient. It's like, no, you got to understand, if we take Rushdoony's model from Kuyper of self-government, family government, church government, state government. It works out like this. The more you teach the individual to fully realize, actualize the self-government, the better they will be for the family government, the better that family will be for the church government, and then the state. So when deacons are concerned about, and I go through this all the time as an officer, there's a lot of times where you feel like you've got to do everything. It's actually like, no, one of your greatest strengths is delegation. So a church that would teach its congregates how to provide for themselves in a multiplicity of ways is delegating some of those responsibilities for mercy ministries, right? Because if you have a church that harps on, say, hospitality, and the church body is constantly together, they're gonna know the needs of the other people in the church. And if they are providing for themselves in efficient ways, they will have abundance by which they can provide for those other families, right? Things like that, where the more that we teach the individual to be free, to be self-sufficient, it just opens the doorway for so many things. And I didn't do it justice, but I was trying to articulate that in my response. But does all that make sense? Like, I hope that, I feel like I'm saying things that, again, I learned from them, but it just didn't, for whatever reason, didn't come to their minds.
Well, absolutely, it does. And I think I'd even try and pose or maybe even answer your own question back to you in light of that, because that's the foundation, like you said, that's the bones, that's the skeleton to which you then enflesh a lot of other work onto, and work in terms of how you manifest those truths, how your theology flows out of your fingertips, so to speak. Because from your feet to your family, to your faith, to your greater community, I think that's something as a concentric ring of circles that it takes place, right? Your family lives somewhere, your church meets somewhere, it's in a particular community, and what are you doing then in that place? And that's why local churches are redeeming places. It does create these cities on a hill, and people point to Moscow. It has, everyone said it, even internally, they've said it's very liberal. Like, there's a lot of kingdom work still left to be done. But people point to these different pockets of where largely the digital dominion is being taken, where there's ministries, there's media networks, there's like the guys out in Ogden, Utah, that I'm a huge fan of, New Christendom Press. They're doing a lot, but there's a lot of physical dominion taking that needs to happen over the place where they are, because that's ultimately where these financial models actually have outputs for investment. Like, you're not going to just pour a ton of funds into the development of a place where you don't live necessarily. I mean, you can, people do that, but most of the time people want to prioritize investing close to home, or something. Really, the main bottom line, I guess, is what I'm getting at, is why do we do any of this? It's for our kids, it's for our grandkids, it's for our posterity.
Right.
And I think contributing to a Christian economy, contributing to your local community and mercy ministry extension and church extension, all of that, like, what is the goal? It's to for human flourishing, first and foremost, to glorify God, right? It is because He's commanded us unto good works and saved us unto good works, but as a gift of faith and grace. So how do we most glorify God and enjoy Him forever? Is we are in full fellowship with Him, and we're in full fellowship with our neighbor, and we love one another. But what does it mean to actually love one another? What are the Levitical laws and the Deuteronomic laws like? What does biblical love look like, other than theonomy and ethics that actually the recon guys were trying to posit? That's what human flourishing ultimately will amount to, is all the nations under the foot of Christ. He's conquered every enemy, captured every thought to the obedience of Christ, and then that kind of method of operating in a society. I've said elsewhere, our physical forms are going to be impacted, right? Our physical forms influence our social forms, and our social forms influence our spiritual forms. And it goes the other direction. How we believe is going to operate, is going to come out in how we operate with one another as a society. But then how we operate as a society is ultimately going to manifest in terms of places. So that's something that, to put meat on the bones of what you just said, like, the more financially stable people are in their own lives and families and households and churches, and then ultimately the fiscal responsibility of communities and the politicians that are overseeing the local resources together, they're going to want to do development projects. They're going to want to create parks and places for people. They're going to want to create opportunities for business incubators to encourage entrepreneurship and innovation. That's what Chalmers did all throughout Scotland, and having a innovative sense by which you can a rising tide lifts all ships. As a Navy man, I'm sure you appreciate
Yeah.
that. So, and I don't mean to just monologue for a lot of that, but really the end goal is there's some practical ways by which people, once you're in that position of wanting to do things, and it's not, you don't even really have to wait. I think God blesses those who pursue Him in those paths as well, wherever you are along that journey. Seeing the opportunity to have finances go towards investing in the future of place, but ultimately it's the future of the place where your kids will inherit, where your grandkids will inherit,
Right.
where the meek will inherit eschatologically. You're not building for something to get destroyed. You're building for something to last and have heirloom quality and have multi-generational works built out. So, anyways, that's kind of the vision.
Yeah.
And then how do you do it?
Right. So it sounds like that's how you would have answered my questions if you were in their seat. And I love that answer, because I think what it leans into, again, somebody can hear that and think, oh, well, that was just all academic. That was all heady. What does that mean practically? We're going to get to that in a second. But at least I think what I was more able to see in your response versus theirs is there is an intrinsic part of the promises of the kingdom that we see in the Old Testament, that the coastlands awaited His law, right? That people were going to be fleeing to the mountain, as it says in Isaiah, and say, let us worship your God because we see the goodness of His law. And law is culture. So really, and you're talking about guys who they have been building culture. We just wanted them to articulate, again, how did you do that? How do we do that? Because I think it's one of the most important commands that Christ gave His disciples, that they will know you by how you love one another, right? If you, they will know you are my disciples by how you love one another as I have loved you, right? So there is a specific way which Christians are to love other Christians, and this inevitably runs to the Christian economy, that is supposed to be different and effective. And I think our American individualism runs head into that. And unfortunately, it's something that we see in other religious communities. They have no problem, right, treating the adherents of their faith in a particular way versus non-believers, right? I think that's somewhat been lost in America because of our hyper-individualism. But it's no, you really ought to start, your love starts with the house of God. And it doesn't end with the infidel, but there is a different way in which you are to love your Christian brothers and sisters than those who are not. But as we're chugging along in time, because we've been cooking up a lot of good stuff here, I wanted to ask you, really, what are some areas the church should recover or explore in order to reestablish involvement in the Christian economy? And I think this inevitably will tie into Mercy Ministries too. You've already laid out a lot of it, talking about Chalmers and some of the things that he's done. But what are your thoughts on that, or what are some practical things?
Yeah, absolutely. And I even just those two beforehand with Ally, knowing that Mercy Ministries and the greater Christian economy are something that what we can talk about ultimately is adding value to that conversation. It's trying to encourage people onto those kinds of thoughts and then works. I love how you frame the question: recover and explore. So recover implies it's been done before. There's something historical to grab from, and then explore is it's conservative and progressive, right? There's people trying to make progress towards the utopian eschaton of the Christian revelation. What does it mean to be moving towards a garden city from a garden? How do you build out the garden city? That's what I want to know, because that's what, as a designer, as a landscape architect, as a development planner, that means something. That's even a model, like a garden city model of development. It's not very effective, by the way. If you ever look up garden cities, they're really and I mean that in terms of the man-made version of what they thought it could be with the concentric circles. It's kind of nice. There's good methods to it. Anyways, the the restoring we talked a lot about from people from the past, and then exploring. I do think, obviously, it's self-aggrandizing. It creates a funnel for the potential interest of prospective development clients, but I do think that's one avenue by which people need to really wake up in our day and age. There's a tremendous amount of wealth and an amount of wealth shift from the previous generation to the next now, where we're looking for what to do. Times are tough. Like building a business, creating spaces in your downtown Main Street, or creating new villages altogether. Investment needs capital, and venture capitalists and private equity investors are kind of holding their cards close to their chest right now during the Biden economy. It seems like there's a goal to get back to a time of, being fat and happy and flourishing, where money's flowing into different projects. Right now, it's kind of tight, and there's high interest rates. So practically, it does look like having an eye to the economy, being able to read the word and read the world, as Doug Wilson likes to say. I think there's some ways to recover and explore some of these tactics of creating places for people to thrive in their families, in their businesses, and then in their church communities. You mentioned gardens, like a community garden behind a church, a cemetery. That's an economic engine. People have to pay for grave plots. And then there's Christian ministries that are looking to build out campuses that have a multi-purpose opportunity space for content creators, for different things that in our day and age, the currency that we traffic in it's largely information. It's largely not combative. Like we're warring with words. So thankfully we're not in King Alfred's Viking marauder type ridden land. Yeah, in our runway. Yeah. But I think Chalmers had an interesting day and age where he was living in, where land was so dirt cheap that you could build 400 or 500 churches in the last 10 years of your life and create an entirely new denomination. Our economy is just not in that place necessarily. Yeah. So thinking about the macro structure or infrastructure even of what we can do with our time, I think there's a little bit more of an emphasis on localism. That's why I think local churches is important. But I like your question, because localism affects mercy ministries. You can help those right in front of you. You can reach those who are in arm's reach, right? You can take the next step that your foot can get to. That's what we need to be focusing on doing in principle. But what that looks like is, how much do we have in our deacons fund? How far will that get us with a food pantry versus creating a garden that perennially creates new stock into our inventory, designing it so that it's beautiful and it's a place where people want to take, as a venue for photography, teaching classes on homesteading through that kind of method. Obviously, like I could help design and plan a garden for the church. That's garden design is what a landscape architect largely does in a lot of ways. But creating things that are true, good, and beautiful, have beautiful trellises, have things that actually they identify your land. I think church campuses, church buildings are one thought of that, but your homestead, if you have a lot of land, creating a family farm that has its own economy seasonally with different products, creating businesses that operate with services and products that, again, are heirloom quality, that are built by people who love you, don't hate you, and, they have a way of honoring God. Those are practical tactics of building and creating, adding content, providing goods and services. But ways to explore are, I think, the Protestant work ethic, and like the Huguenots in Paris were the best artisans and craftsmen of chocolate and watches and shoes and cathedrals. And then when the Huguenot persecution fled, the people who made amazing chocolate went to Switzerland. The people who made amazing watches, moved to wherever it was. I think shoes went to Italy. And now what we know as the world's best such and such is probably because it was a Huguenot who had a really good sense of what it means to be a Christian contributing to the economy. So recovering some of that, and knowing your history is one thing, but letting it actually flow out into our lives is exploring it in the local sourdough bakery bread shop. Like what Christian moms can just come together, and what Christian families can create a space for this beautiful artisanal baked goods thing to just redeem the downtown of wherever. Yeah. Are you in Fort Lauderdale? Where's the
I'm in Jacksonville. Yeah.
Okay. So I mean, locally, having something that's it's a light to a dark world, it's salt to a decaying culture. Having something that then speaks to a Christian presence of own space, and it's community influence. That is the method that a lot of people have been articulating. We hear that from people like Aaron Rand, talking about owned space. It's just a matter of that means buying and building or renovating or identifying and beautifying and adorning. And it means actually taking places and redeeming them. Go figure. That's
Crazy.
so.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the digital space is good, and that's a seemingly unprecedented network to leverage. So that's the more broader Christian economy that, like, CrossPolitic is creating these business leader networks and stuff. I think using the sales and means of providing those same sourdough loaves across the nation and sending them, shipping them, that's great. But it's the fountainhead of that is localism, I think.
Right. Yeah, man, that was there was so much in what you just said. I'm like, dang, like we need another episode because again, one, it was saturated in actual practical application, and it highlighted, I think, because I'm always thinking in the reductio or the reverse of, why haven't we been doing this, or what concerns have we had that has prevented us. But man, yeah, I'm gonna have to go back and listen to a lot of what you said, and then maybe even do like clips out of it, because there was a lot there. But really, what I wanted to hone in on as we land the plane is exactly what you just did. You articulated practical applications of like, what does that look like? What are some ways, again, to recover and explore? I wanted to read for you and for our audience. I saw this post that it was originally from a Christian woman that then a guy reposted and said, this is the kind of practical advice that like congregations need, and it's a sign of the times that preachers aren't saying it, right? So this is in one sense a judgment, and another it's very, very helpful. But when I was talking about practical applications, when you were talking about practical applications, I think a lot of it is what's here. So let me read this. It says, so this is from the Transformed Wife. She's got a Twitter handle at Godly Womanhood, right? And she said, move where it's cheaper, downsize, get rid of one car and cable, buy used things, have a few clothes, eat real food from scratch, use vinegar, water, and a splash of soap to clean with, hand wash dishes, turn off lights when not using, use a tiny bit of makeup, laundry, soap, etc., fix things instead of buying new, do anything it takes, woman, to be home with your babies. They need you. For whatever reason, if a man were to turn around from the pulpit and say something like that, apparently he'd be overstepping his bounds. Like, you know what I mean? Like, that is nuts. And that's what we're talking about, though, where it's practical application. That, here's the thing, we always try to use the defense of, well, not all X is like Y. In other words, well, that might not work for everyone. That's fine. She didn't say that, but at least she provided some practical, applications of this Christian worldview, right? Where, again, I think we hide behind a series of 1,000 doctrinal excuses, but that's what we're talking about here. Things like that at least give people the opportunity to try it, see if it works, and if it doesn't, try something else. But that's what people, I think, are looking for from their pulpits is, again, we rightfully so dig into these biblical principles, but then we don't supply people the practices. And I think we might be running into, we got to be careful not to run into some kind of Gnostic reality where we're not actually equipping people. We're just filling their heads with all kinds of different things. But I didn't know if you wanted to respond to those comments, because I think that's a lot of what I was trying to get at in my responses, or at least in my questions of, yeah, I'm not saying that these things should be done by everyone, but they, in light of, you just reminded me, this is what you said that was so brilliant just a few minutes ago, is I don't think the guys responded in light of the world we're currently living in, right? Like, in light of the current economy, and we're talking about freeing men from all of the snares that entail with them right now, where they're dependent on basically the state for their food, their entertainment, their education, their healthcare. And we're talking about breaking them out of that. How do we break them out of that without teaching them practical ways of being self-sufficient? And I want to emphasize the practical there. So that's, when you said that, I was like, yeah, man, that's what I'm talking about. That's what she was talking about. Do you have any thoughts on all that?
I love the Transformed Wife's platform and what she says often. I agree. I think Body Life comes in where obviously that's not necessary advice for everyone. People who live in, $3 million houses and have 4 cars, like, they don't need to sell all 3 cars and just go down to one.
Right.
And only buy used. Like, there is a Christian economy with a gradient of wealth. And I think that's back to the distributism model of it's not stealing from the rich, giving to the poor. It's a matter of like, how do we view investing within the body to build up one another unto the work that God has called us, his people, to build his kingdom to. And, the day and age, understanding the signs of the times, being the sons of Issachar and the Sonison understanding of seeing how multiple converging paths meet at a confluence, how our financial straits are within the body, like the shepherd of the sheep knows those things, or ought to. And
Right.
the deacons ought to know where the needs are, right? And that's kind of back to this. The church has overlap into those kinds of financial hardships. So the people who are battening down the hatches are trying to be as frugal as possible. Our family, your family, I don't know where we all fall in that, but there is some degree of, financial hardship and frugality that we're trying to operate under. I think those are all pointing to what you're saying, self-sufficiency,
Right.
in light of, we're dependent upon the Holy Spirit to actually do anything through our lives. So obviously there's like an idol out of self-sufficiency and self-reliance and stuff. But I hear that as like, well, that's just, you're just trying not to, do the work of actually homesteading, right?
Right. Right.
And
Right. Right.
again, body life, like not everyone needs to homestead. There's people who are urbanites who are called to that part of being the body of Christ there. So it's context dependent, but I do think the overall goal in whatever situation that you are of taking responsibility, like we talked about, where your feet are, where your family is, where your body of faith is, and then over the community. That's the masculine nature, not the godly womanhood, but like the masculine assumption, glad assumption of sacrificial responsibility. That's what we're talking about. Like be a man and do all those things to actually, create a better future for your family and for your kids. Absolutely.
Beautiful. Yeah, that was beautiful, man. I think if I could summarize what my hill to die on is that I think in the reform circles we are surgically precise with our doctrine, and because of that, we get very, very worried we're going to make a false cut. Like, so when pastors steer away from giving practical advice, it's probably because they can't guarantee that it's going to work. And I think because they can't guarantee that, like they can guarantee that the doctrine they're teaching is true and from the word, but because they can't guarantee the other on the other end, they're very hesitant. And I'm like, no, like we have to be, willing to make mistakes here. Particularly again, in the times we live in where a majority of people, I think a majority of people, a majority of Americans are in the situation where it's like your money is not doing what it used to be able to do anymore. Right, you are not able to move socially within the spheres of your life as freely as you used to, and because of that, we've got to be on the offensive. So, my computer is about to die. We are coming up on an hour. So, Connor, I thank you so much for your time. I hope that this was profitable for you, anyone who listens. And again, I think I pray that this will again. We talked about some practical applications, but again, this was never to be you and I's question to answer. This was always supposed to be the CrossPolitic. They're the professionals, right? I want them to be able to articulate the kind of practice.
Thank you. Yeah, this has been truly a blessing. I do as well. Pray it's been profitable for everybody, building up the kingdom, adding value to people's walk with the Lord. I think the best way to reach me is either through my website, as Ekklesia, Ekklesia Design.com, or that's the Twitter. Sorry, I'm on Twitter now. I haven't posted very much yet, but Instagram is probably the way to direct message if you want to just have a chat or conversation. Ekklesia.design. But anyways, very grateful for the time, Cole. I'm so thankful for your platform. I pray that the Lord blesses it and establishes the work of your hands. I don't know if it's actually still recording because I think Cole's computer turned off. Thank you so much, Cole. I appreciate all of the time that you gave to me this morning. I appreciate our conversation being fruitful. I pray that that's what it is for everybody who's able to listen. The best way to reach me is through my website, EkkleesiaDesign.com, Ekklesia. Design.com, or on Instagram, Ekklesia.design. That's the handle. But very grateful for your time. Thank you again, brother. Blessings to you.